Welcome, everyone, to one of our last events at the Union this term. A reminder that you can, as the audience, engage with the conversation by submitting questions via the online form on the YouTube page. I'll try to get to as many as I can. There have been lots already. Tonight, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Rory Stewart. He needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Rory was MP for Penrith and the Border from 2010 to 2019. And served as the International Development Secretary during the second May administration. Before that, he was Minister in the Ministry of Justice with responsibility for prisons, a junior minister in the Foreign Office, the International Development Department again, and in DEFRA, as well as the chair of the Defence Select Committee between 2014 and 2015. Prior to entering Parliament, Rory had a career in foreign affairs, serving as an infantry officer briefly in the Black Watch before working for the UK diplomatic service in Jakarta and Montenegro, and as the coalition deputy governor in a region of southern Iraq following the interventions of 2003. On leave from the Foreign Office, he walked for 21 months through the Middle East, staying in 500 village houses on the journey. He has authored a number of books, including The Places in Between, an account of his time walking in the Middle East. Currently, Rory is a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University, teaching politics and international relations. Rory, it's a pleasure to have you this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And James, can I just ask a quick question? How many of you are actually, as it were, on campus in Cambridge, and how many are having to work from home? How's COVID affecting you all?
COVID has affected us all quite extensively at the university. Term was cancelled, but funnily enough, a large part of the student body is still in Cambridge. I don't know what the precise statistics are, but it's a very large minority.
But some people on this call will have been working from home.
That's exactly right. Lots of them will. This event, amongst others, has been open to all so that we could sort of keep the conversation going whilst people are all sort of locked up at home. I have plenty to get through this evening. And as I said, we've already had lots of questions submitted. Personally, I'm going to try and pick up on some of the themes that we've been discussing with other guests throughout the term. And I also want to talk about many, if not all, the things that you try to grapple with in government. So most of that's political, but funny enough, a large majority of the questions we've received are not to do with politics at all. But I thought I'd start off with what you're doing now. You're at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale. This is not your first time working in academia in the States. You were at Harvard University working on human rights between 2008 and 2010. What have you been up to this time?
I teach seminars for graduate students, and they're mostly people who are going on to go into the civil service or they want to become politicians. I've taught a course called Politics in Crisis and a course called Governing Well, which I'm in the middle of at the moment. And then next semester, I'm teaching in a course called Grand Strategy. But basically, these are sort of almost vocational training. I mean, these are attempts to try to help people who want to go into government to think through what's going on. So, last week, we went in a lot of detail through the flood response in the UK 2014-2015, what it means to be a minister dealing with floods. We've done coronavirus in detail. We're going to do a bit of Brexit. And I'm doing prisons. And essentially, I'm trying to get people to think through some of the reality of being a politician, including things like fundraising, campaigning, and a lot of the bad bits of politics too.
Yeah, well, hopefully some of that we'll pick up later in the discussion. I'm teaching first year politics students, and it's quite difficult over Zoom. Are you guys in person at the moment with masks on?
We're in person with masks on. So big room that I think is meant for 200 people with only about 12 of us in it. But It's in person, and it's great, really good.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to ask you about American politics, actually. You've picked an extraordinary moment to find yourself in the States, given what's transpired over the last year or so. So my first question is a comparative one. What are the similarities and differences between American and British politics at the moment, as you see it? What's better, what's worse about American political discourse?
Well, I think the first thing is that this fundamental theme of populism is very much something that doesn't stop at national borders. So in America, people tend to assume that Donald Trump is a very, very American phenomenon. And they imagine that the reason why you have that type of politics is because of things which are very specific to America. For example, decline in the Rust Belt. problems in Detroit and Michigan. But of course, coming from the UK, it's much more obvious to me that this is something that is happening in India, in Turkey, in the United Kingdom, in Hungary, in Poland, and in the United States, which suggests that whatever it is, isn't something that's just particular to a type of constitution or a type of economic situation. And that has a more depressing implication, which is that you can't fix it in the way that you might hope just by doing an economic regeneration program in Michigan or changing the US Constitution to change the way that parties select their leaders. So that's the first big thing, this big fact of populism, this big fact of the way that people campaign. And I think my growing realization that populism is not any longer something that is just a preserve of fringe parties. It's something that's been taken into the mainstream because parties that see themselves as moderate, as they're beaten by populist campaigns, are more and more tempted down that path. So in the United Kingdom, you will see the Labour Party and Lib Dems increasingly interested in what can we do with three-word slogans? How are we going to be able to learn from these techniques on social media? In other words, all of politics will be dragged into this. And one feature of this is the feature of the permanent campaign, the sense that really politicians are fundamentally engaged more and more of their time in the business of winning elections and have less and less time to devote to governing.
Yeah, I suppose the questions that one asks in politics are just as important as the answers people try to find for them. Initially, I was going to ask whether you thought or whether you were worried that some of the things about American politics were bleeding into British politics, but that seems to be the wrong question from what you're saying. It seems that the sort of thing that's stimulating populist politics, as you call it, in the States is the same in the UK. It's not that one's bleeding into the other.
I think it's, I mean, there will be specific things. And of course, it's true that there are economic causes that contribute to this problem. But the fact that it is happening in such different societies, such different economies, I mean, there's not much really in common with the structures of India, Hungary, Turkey, the United States. I mean, they're very different places. Brazil, suggests that you also need to look at phenomena like social media, the way that modern marketing techniques work. You might also want to look at the possibility that this type of politics reflects, for some people, a turning away from politics, a lack of interest, sort of indifference to politics, which allows people to be caught up in these slightly flimsy campaigns.
So, would you say that the situation as it comes to sort of advertising, money, the things that sort of seem to fuel populist politics at the moment, is it worse in the States, or is that a naive stance to take for Britons?
The scale is worse in the States. So the amount of money that you need to raise is ridiculous in the United States, and you have to raise it from very small contributions. So I was talking to a US Congresswoman recently who had made 100,000 hours of fundraising calls in 2 years. But it exists in Britain too. When I was running to be Mayor of London as an independent, I was having to try to compete with the Labour and Conservative parties. I'll probably spend $4 million in these campaigns. And as you know, anyone on this call who's been involved in trying to raise money for charity would know, right? It's pretty difficult raising $5,000 doing a sponsored walk, but raising $4 million is a lot of donations, and it's very strange. I mean, I think what you realize in politics is that to raise that kind of money and to try to get the number of votes you need to win, right? Ideally, you want to try to get 50% of the votes in the London election in 2 rounds, but you want to get 50% of the votes, means that you have to stretch a very long way beyond your comfort zone. You cannot just continue saying purely what you believe in. And so it's a real threat to your integrity. I think that's what's in common. I mean, I think the scales may be different, but fundamentally these pressures are pressures on your integrity. So one way of putting it, I suppose, is that I think often about the contrast with when I used to run a charity, a non-profit in Afghanistan. So for 3 years, I ran this charity. I had to raise a lot of money for it, and I had to get a lot of supporters, but I didn't need to convince half the people to support me. and I could walk away from a certain amount of money. So I could remain quite pure to what I wanted to do. So what I wanted to do was restore part of the old city of Kabul and work on traditional crafts and buildings. If somebody came to me and said, but the thing I really care about is fighting the Taliban in Helmand, I would say, well, thank you very much, but I don't want your money, right? And that was quite important because the US government was putting about $1 billion into that stuff, but I could afford to say no. In politics, it's much more difficult. If your donors are, for example, in London, often bankers who are obsessed with problems of traffic in central London, which may not matter to most voters in London, right? In fact, most voters in London barely go into central London and don't particularly care about the traffic in central London. You will very soon be pulled in these dinners and fundraising things into making pompous comments about traffic. And you may not care about it really very much at all.
Well, I mean, let's talk about politicians in jobs at the moment. You know, you have the rare advantage, Rory, of being on the outside looking in on politics, which must be quite a change given you've been at the centre of government for so long. What are your assessments on how? What's your assessment on how the government has gone about its work since the 2019 election? An enormous agenda which included leaving the European Union, levelling up the regions, but of course it has inevitably been dominated by its response to COVID this last year. What has been your assessment of their performance?
Well, I think essentially there are two things that have been going on, which are COVID and Brexit. The rest of it is very marginal. There's been talk about levelling up, but there's not much evidence that much levelling up has taken place or that there's a particularly clear plan on how you level up. In fact, I think levelling up is something that people have been talking about using different words in Britain for nearly 70 or 80 years. And where my constituency in Cumbria was surrounded by programs going back to the 1930s, 1940s from governments, trying to transform the northwest of England without much success. So I'd park that. I think really it's Brexit and COVID. On COVID, they were very slow and didn't really have the instincts to respond to the early stage of the disease. And we can come back to talk about that. That's partly, I think, because populist politics leaves politicians like Boris Johnson not in a very confident position dealing with that kind of complexity and expertise. I mean, what he chose to do was listen to the experts, but in a sense, that is the flip side of ignoring the experts. Really what you need in dealing with experts is to be able to challenge them and respect them at the same time, right? You need the sort of conversation with them that someone like Angela Merkel was able to have. And that's probably because Angela Merkel was a biochemist with a doctorate in science and therefore was much more comfortable sitting around a table having those challenging conversations. They've done much better, though, obviously, at the vaccination. And that is, in a sense, shows two things. It shows, firstly, that's where the data lies, and we have the infrastructure, the NHS, to do it. But they also made a pretty imaginative, bold choice in buying a lot of these vaccines before they'd been approved. They paid quite a lot of money to sign up these deals, and they've been completely vindicated. So in a way, you get a sense of a government that its weakness is probably in the more complex, subtle conversations at the beginning of lockdown about, you know, what Singapore are doing, what South Korea are doing, how do we do test and trace, what do we make of evolving medical science, but is much better at the logistical, let's just pump this through, let's get the vaccines out, let's throw the kitchen sink at it.
Just to jump in, is it too neat a distinction to say that there's something about vaccinations that's sort of headline simple, I dare say it, but slogan-y, and there's something about the hard graft of track and trace that sort of ties into what you're saying about populist politics?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that a populist leader who, almost by definition, the point about populism is it's a form of marketing simplification, right? It presents things in very primary colors. Everything's very binary, straightforward, right? It's not, we are going to get a Brexit deal with tariff-free access, but friction over rules of origin. It's, we're going to get Brexit done, right? So if your objective is to get vaccines into people's arms and you're prepared to spend a lot of money and actually take a bit of risk, that you could be criticized for having hired the wrong person or spent too much money, you can hammer it through. Where populism struggles, where this type of politics struggles, is that if you're campaigning that the world is simple and that there are easy answers and that you don't listen to the experts. And suddenly you find yourself sitting around a cabinet table where you're aware that people are making complicated arguments about herd immunity, about transmission. There are different analogies between influenza and COVID. You're having to trade off the interests of the elderly against the interests of the young. You're having to think about the implications of schools, the economy. Then you need a very, very different brain, a very different mindset. And I think that's a mindset and brain that seem to have suited non-populist politicians like Angela Merkel very well, whereas ironically, actually, she hasn't done as well on the vaccination.
Seriousness in politics is something you've spoken, at length at, and I want to come to that later. But just whilst we're on, I do want to talk to you about COVID, because I think it's interesting how much it intersects with one of your real interests in government, which is international development. You were, as I noted at the very start, the Secretary of State for International Development. So I want to spend some time talking about that subject in two parts. Firstly, and not directly related to COVID, is the FCO-DFID merger. And then after that, I want to quickly talk about the relevance of international development and aid to the challenge of coronavirus on the global stage. So first, you were a vocal opponent of the end to the 0.7 commitment to international aid and the departmental merger. The argument the government is broadly making is that we should do aid, but it should be connected to interest-based foreign policy, and this is why the departments should be merged. That way we'll still be engaging, they would say, on the international stage, but it's British foreign policy is being driven by the Foreign Office. What's your view on this rationale?
Okay, so James, just a couple of things. I think the first problem with what the government's done is that the Prime Minister explicitly promised repeatedly when he was running against me for the leadership, right? It was one of the things I kept raising in the leadership, that he wouldn't do this. So I think the first problem is that he's promised repeatedly, particularly to the sort of centre-left of the Conservative Party, he would not be merging these departments or getting rid of the 0.7%. He's done it, you're right, and the rationale is this rationale around the national interest. It doesn't make much sense to me. If you look at the places where they're going to have to take the cuts, which are Syria, Yemen, and a lot of the most extreme crisis centers of Africa, and places like Pakistan, these are the almost definitional national security threats in the world. And if the United Kingdom is serious about being a global power, is serious about being a permanent member of the Security Council, these are the places you would naturally expect the United Kingdom to be involved. So I think what one can conclude from this is that there's always been a tension in the Brexit project between people who talk about Brexit as a sort of expansive global Britain reaching out into the world, dominating the world, and people who seem to be going for more of a little England, pull up the barriers, retreat, island nation sense. In the end, it's the latter that's won out. It's the retreat that's won out. This is not a government that genuinely has a vision, a strategic vision of UK foreign policy in the sense of reaching out into the world. If it had been, it would have fought harder to preserve the money and think much more creatively about what its role could be and how it could play a much more dominant role in the United Nations. It would also, incidentally, be increasing the core budget of the Foreign Office. Now, one of the problems they're facing is that they've cut the budget of DFID, but they haven't actually increased the core budget of the Foreign Office. You're not seeing a massive expansion of the number of diplomats abroad, the number of embassies abroad. The money hasn't become any more flexible. Many of the old bureaucratic problems that you had with international aid, which are about very strict rules on how it can be spent, where it can be spent, remain in place. There's just a smaller pot to play with. At the same time, they're putting more into battleships, right? More into aircraft carriers, frigates, destroyers. There's this aim to give Britain the largest navy in Europe, but very little clarity about why. And my suspicion is that it's some combination of thinking this is good industrial policy, good way of generating high technology jobs, and pure symbolism. It doesn't seem to be tied into any real sense of why you need a deep water navy of that sort if you're retreating from the world at the same time.
Yeah, you put it, I can't remember where it was, but I saw you put it nicely elsewhere that this isn't exactly an administration that's trying to cut cloth fiscally. It's not that there's no money. The government's spending a lot of money at the moment on everything, basically, apart from international aid, it seems. So this is choice rather than a sort of act of fiscal necessity. And
a very popular choice. I mean, I think that's the most important thing, James, to remember, which is that so many of the Brexit voters, so many of the people in my constituency who are on the right of the Conservative Party, hated international aid. They didn't like the idea of giving British taxpayers money to poor people in other countries. So whatever it's dressed up as being, it's hugely popular with that chunk of the party. And the Prime Minister is very aware of that. He might pretend this is something driven by COVID or this is some new bit of foreign policy, but basically he's appealing to a voter group that doesn't want to spend too much money on overseas aid.
So you sort of talked about the Little England narrative. You were a Remainer, but after the referendum results, you were sort of almost the government spokesperson for the May deal. And you believed that, we had to deliver on the referendum result in some way. Presumably that's because you see a vision for the United Kingdom outside the European Union, a possibility, if you will. What does that look like? Does it centre around aid? Does it centre around vaccinations? What is it?
So my vision, which I thought was encapsulated in the May deal, was for what you would call a very soft Brexit. So I reckoned that it had been a very close result. 52% have voted for Brexit, 48% have voted Remain. So we should go, as it were, for 52, 48% Brexit, right? We should, yes, okay, respect the result, leave the European Union, but remain as close as we could to Europe, diplomatically, economically, politically. So I would have gone for essentially a customs union, very high degree of regulatory alignment, essentially open borders, pretty close to single market, and not do what the government's chosen to do. The government's chosen to accept much more friction at those borders and a much more distant relationship to the European Union. Now, there is no answer, obviously, to the question of what the right Brexit was or what people meant by Brexit, because people presumably meant a million different things by Brexit. But we also had another thing that mattered deeply to me that we lost along the way, which was trying to reconcile people in Britain. I thought the government's job was to try to find a compromise between people who voted Brexit and people who voted Remain, that we needed to try to bring the country together. I was worried that we're creating a sort of permanent civil war, and that whatever the arguments for a hard Brexit were, one of the biggest problems is that it was just further alienating that almost half the population that have voted for Remain.
So my second question that I just want to raise on international development, then we'll move on. Your first speech from the dispatch box as the Secretary of State for International Development concerned global immunisation challenges, which seems almost eerie in hindsight. But the government seems to be retreating, as you say, from its commitment to international aid, but it's a willing participant in the COVAX project. How do you see that intersecting with Britain, global aid, those sorts of themes?
Well, I think that's a very worthwhile thing to be doing. Remember, there are many, many other countries participating in that, but I think for Britain to be generously involved makes sense. I think it's an argument which, for people who are worried about international development and want to link it to national security, it's relatively straightforward to explain why dealing with pandemics in other people's countries is ultimately good for you in the United Kingdom. So I think that's fine. I think that's relatively uncontroversial. It is interesting, though, that you referred to my time in DFID. One of the reasons why I came out very early as a critic of the government's COVID response, why I thought we should be moving much more quickly into lockdown, is I'd been the person responsible for Ebola. And I very much had felt then, and indeed I'd felt as a flooding minister before, that there is a sort of tendency in government to always be too slow, to always do slightly less than it could. There are always reasons to delay. We need more information, we need more data, we don't want to spend too much, we're horrified by the potential costs of action. There's always some scientist that can produce something that sounds comforting and give you an excuse not to do anything. So a lot of what I've learned in government is really about these sort of psychological elements, which are so difficult to put down on a piece of paper, but which are the absolute substance of government. the weird reasons why we sort of muff things, fail to grip them, most of which is to do with human psychology, not to do with, talk about facts or evidence-based policy or science, just to do with why we don't want to cause trouble around a committee table, why we like to be optimistic.
There's lots of sort of personal political philosophy coming through. So I kind of want to move on to, your sort of personal views on politics, if that's okay. I think there's a few curious lines of inquiry we might pick up. One thing that really has interested me is the relationship between local and national politics. I think there's a tension. I don't think they're necessarily exclusionary, but I just wanted to draw out a little bit your views on these subjects. So the politics of the local seems to be really, really important for you, and it's sort of implicit in that attention to detail, that seriousness point that you keep bringing up. It's evidenced in your walking through the Middle East and staying in hundreds of people's homes. You did similarly in your run for Mayor of London with the Come Kick With Me project before the lockdowns were introduced. I remember in the leadership contest for the Conservative Party, talking and debating with as many people in the street as you could. Could you tell us a little bit more about where that approach to politics comes from, why it's important to you?
Yes, I mean, it began for me because really my life was changed by this walk. So I, having been a diplomat working for the Foreign Office in embassies around the world, decided in my late 20s to go take 2 years off and walk across Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal. And those 500 nights in the village houses showed me a world so different from the world we were talking about in the embassies that it completely changed my perspective on the world. And when I returned to Kabul, and then later when I worked in Washington and heard people speak about Afghanistan, I realized that what they were saying had nothing to do with what's going on around. So they would say, all Afghans want a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And I would think, no, that doesn't describe, Commandant Walim Haji Mohsin Khan in this particular village, who is not speaking to his neighbor because there's a feud, and who can't read and write, and etc. It was the extremity of that gap, and that then it was something I took with me into British politics, which is I felt there was a huge gap between the sort of theoretical way that people described my constituency in Cumbria and what it was actually like on the ground. So, and politicians are very, very good at using sort of superficial jargon and, and we see it all the time. I mean, if you get stuck, you just sort of drone on about sustainability, transparency, accountability, predictability. But fundamentally, what you're doing is you're retreating to bland, abstract words away from what it's like, what makes this place different to somewhere else. Its identity, its history. And I think the final thing I'd say is there's an astonishing arrogance in this idea that somehow an MP or a minister or a senior civil servant is ever going to have a brain big enough to actually encompass, what's going on amongst more than 60 million people, all of whom actually in Britain are pretty educated, healthy, serious people. Right? It's ridiculous that I sort of somehow am in a position of pretending I know what should happen when I don't know.
And so that sort of immersion in places is what you think is missing from current politics. People, Bentham calls it nonsense, but sort of stuck in discussions of abstract themes, and we fail to get to grips with the actual problems that people experience in day-to-day life. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's nonsense is a very good word. I think there's also part of it which, where Bentham himself and his traditions more to blame, right? Which is a sort of utilitarian mindset and an attempt to try to create models and calculuses and ways of measuring, which don't really capture the texture and the paradoxes and the contradictions of life. I mean, let me take my constituency, Cumbria. So on the surface, it was an incredibly poor constituency. average incomes were under £16,000 a year, featured as one of the poorest places in Britain. But at the same time, there were only 56 long-term unemployed in my constituency. Right? There was almost no unemployment. And a lot of the people who were on very low incomes were upland sheep farmers who were incredibly proud of what they were doing and whose children wanted to continue doing it. Next door was a constituency which was theoretically wealthier, but which had much higher unemployment rates, much higher addiction rates, much higher social problems. So I was being struck all the time with it. And you know, my constituency, you know, came out in these ridiculous charts as being, I think, the happiest or second happiest place in Britain, right? Whatever that means. But you could sort of see what you were getting at. I mean, it's the Northern Lake District. It's unbelievably beautiful. People are very proud to live there. But I never really found, when I was a minister dealing with rural development, that anybody was catching any of these contradictions, any of this complexity, had any clear idea actually of what Cumbria was or what to do for it. It was just a general idea, oh, we need to increase incomes, or we need to create more jobs, and what are we going to do? We're going to build a factory. I mean, despite the fact that obviously that made no sense in Cumbria. Nobody's going to want to build a major car factory in the middle of the Lake District. But anyway, enough of that rant, James. But I'm just trying to come back again and again to the sense that nobody really knows what they're talking about. And the tragedy, of course, is that in many ways, many of my colleagues don't think that's awfully important. In fact, if they were to hear me talking, they'd think, oh, you know, what's he talking about, right? What we've got to do is win the election, right? Don't talk in this complicated way, right? Get your 3-word slogan, smack it out, get it on the doorstep, get the right headlines, get the right coverage, win and destroy the opposition. Don't get caught up in all this stuff about what is Britain, what is the role of a minister, how can we change the world? Forget it, win.
Well, I think a nice way to bridge the local politics issues and the national politics issues, and sort of the elephant in the room here, is Scotland. Your family are Highland Scots. You spent a lot of time walking through Perthshire when you were younger. You're very much rooted in the area. But this is also, in my opinion, and it's not a controversial view, this is the key political question facing the UK at this moment in time, and possibly for the last 300 years. Are you worried about the situation in Scotland? Is the government, to follow on what you've just said, dealing too much in abstractions and failing to get involved with the issues that, you know, are actually important on the ground in Scotland, the local politics that you think is so important?
I think it is an incredibly important issue. I think it's a very difficult issue. I think the SNP have been very skillful for 30 years in what they've managed to do. They've managed to be nationalists while pretending not to be nationalists. So nationalism is fundamentally a pretty brutal project. Nationalism is really, in the end, about drawing borders. Scottish nationalism is basically about cutting yourself off from everyone else in the United Kingdom and saying, we're Scots, you're not. And it's also implicitly about blaming other people. It's about saying all our problems are to do with London and the English, and if we get rid of them, we're going to be much better off. It's a sort of subconscious message. And it's very dangerous because it is almost never true in life that you're a victim and that someone else is to blame. And if you could just get rid of them, your whole life is going to improve. But they've been very good at doing that, and very good at somehow keeping that subliminal while talking as though they're incredibly progressive, pro-immigration, talk a lot about Mrs. Thatcher and the coal mines, very much portray themselves as opposition to the Conservatives, very much portray themselves as the nice people. Right? I mean, it's a very odd thing. I mean, nationalism is a nasty phenomenon, but they present it as a very kind of nice thing, nice progressive thing.
Sturgeon, of course, always says that she regrets that national is in the name of her party.
Right. Exactly.
She's a Social Democrat, basically.
Yeah. It's a fascinating thing, because if you say to a young Scot, look, do you really think the people on the other side of the border are different to you if you cross over to Carlisle or cross to Berwick or go down to Newcastle? Do you really think this is a completely, Newcastle's completely different from Glasgow? No, of course it isn't, right? I mean, I mean, in fact, compared to almost anywhere else in the world, there is so much in common, right? In our languages, our supermarkets, our media, our clothes, our everything, right? And there are these weird other things that we have in common. So Scotland, very conscious of having voted Remain, but of course London voted overwhelmingly Remain. So in that way, London and Scotland have a lot in common, although Scots hate to think that. They see London fundamentally as the enemy, right? Or Scottish nationalists see London as the enemy. But dealing with these things is very, very tough, because Scotland is right that it does not feature enough in the conversations in the Westminster Parliament. And that's not just Scotland. This is a problem for Northern England. It's a problem for Wales. It's a problem for the rural areas. It's a very, very odd thing, Westminster and modern politics, and it doesn't do well with the local. And I think,
sorry, yeah, Rory, it seems like there's a sort of a tough sort of similarity between the arguments made by Brexiteers about, you know, self-determination, decision-making being closer to the people that it affects, with the arguments of the SNP. And I've been thinking about this a lot. Is that going to be a problem going forward?
Well, it's a challenge if the people fighting against them are Brexiteers. Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm a Remainer is that I think it's more consistent, right? I'm saying I don't believe in drawing new borders. I don't think that you make your life better by getting rid of other people. That's why I voted Remain. That's also why I want Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom. I'm also a little bit skeptical about referendum. But if you're somebody who supported referenda in the past, and you're somebody who believes about getting smaller and more local, then yes, you're right. You slightly seem to have conceded some intellectual ground to the SNP. However, the extraordinary thing about politicians is they don't seem to mind too much contradicting themselves. So I think we can expect that to flip on its head.
I'm kind of loath to say this now that you've just criticised sort of abstract ideas, but I'm going to throw a few out. There's a conversation going on about devolution, about referendums, about federalism. Do you see? You clearly don't see a simple fix here, but in a couple of words, is there a path forward here? Do you see one?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm afraid our system is really, really tired, and I absolutely believe ultimately we need a constitutional change. Mm. This doesn't make any sense the way we run ourselves. It's not a good way of running a country. So I would want to have a written constitution, and I'd want to rethink everything from the way local councils work right the way up to the centre, because I am in despair. I think we're living on borrowed time, and we have a creaking system that is increasingly rubbish. And I find that difficult to say because I come from a conservative tradition, and I'm very normally traditional minded. I'm respectful towards tradition, and I grew up with very romantic ideas about the British Constitution and all this kind of stuff. But I'm afraid 10 years in politics has really convinced me that it's impossible really to defend the way we do things. I think it's mad.
I really wish we could spend a bit longer on this. I did initially invite you for a debate on whether the kingdom was no longer united, but this was probably a better forum to get you to visit the
Union. I also think, James, debates are over. You probably should say that to the Cambridge Union, but I think...
Well, we'll have to respectfully disagree there, but hopefully we can get you back to discuss Scotland. I want to quickly move on because I do want to leave time for some audience questions. I have two more topics that I want to pick up on. One is the seriousness, as I mentioned, but I'll leave that to the end. The other one is the Conservative Party. It's no secret that you are not a particular fan of the current Conservative government, but I wanted to ask a bit about your own place in the party, your views of where it is now and its future. A sort of simple question. Why do you think you were unsuccessful in the leadership contest?
Unsuccessful leadership contest. I think fundamentally, Boris Johnson is a very, very difficult person to beat. MPs sensed that this was somebody who could win a resounding election. They sensed that for the core vote, people felt they needed to get Brexit done, and they wanted someone like Boris who felt they could get Brexit done. And whatever people felt about people like me, they were completely horrified at my talk about sort of compromise and reaching across the Labour Party and trying to use citizens' assemblies to get a compromise on Brexit and things. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is there's always been a war in the Conservative Party, which gets papered over again and again. But fundamentally, we underestimate how angry people were with David Cameron and the modernisation project. So the things that seemed sort of natural to me coming in 2010, my support for gay marriage, international aid, these sort of things. In fact, I was a Remainer. These things, which were the government policy and which most of my intake into Parliament took for granted, turned out to be unpopular with probably 80% of the Conservative Party membership. And they were much angrier and resented our votes on those things much more than I understood. So that when the knives finally came out in those final few weeks, it's extraordinary to suddenly realize that when people were turning against me, they weren't just turning against me, they were turning against David Cameron, right? They were turning against Theresa May, they were turning against almost everything that we'd done, they were turning against the coalition with the Lib Dems. I mean, there was somehow buried in the Conservative Party, David Cameron and others had convinced themselves that this, a victory had been won in the mid-1990s, defeating the Maastricht rebels, and that side of the Conservative Party had gone, and it was exactly wrong. Right? It had turned out that actually that was the Conservative Party, and the rest of us were living on borrowed time. We'd somehow convinced ourselves that we spoke for the Conservative Party because we tended to be the people who were ministers. But in fact, we did not.
So, well, basically, it seems that timing played an important part there. It might be the case you right man, wrong time. You sort of said that Boris Johnson said the right things about Brexit, and that might have been what sort of got him over the line. I saw a fascinating tweet you put out some weeks ago, which was broadly about Disraeli and Gladstone, and you said that if both of them are on Twitter now, you would rather follow Gladstone than than Disraeli. And I probably read far too much into that, but I think maybe not. You were a Labour Party member in your youth. You were remarkably incredibly popular with Liberal Democrats, I've realised. What makes you a Conservative? And I suppose, connected to that, what makes you a Conservative and not perhaps a Liberal?
So I'm James, I would can't spend too long on this if you want to get on questions, but I'm a huge admirer of Gladstone, and I probably was a Conservative when I was younger for the same reason that Gladstone was, and probably have become more uncomfortable with it for the same reason that Gladstone did, which is that if you put a huge... I'm a Conservative because I believe in tradition, prudence, moderation, love of country. I have a sort of gentle Burkean attachment to rural communities, to history. But on almost any moral issue, I suppose my politics is closer to that of the left.
Well, you frequently described yourself as belonging to the One Nation tradition. So you said it lots in your contest for the leadership of the party. You said that the people that broadly supported you in that election were primarily derived from those that subscribe to that set of values. So we've actually asked this to a few guests who have come and spoken to us, and I think it's fascinating. But what does it mean? I mean, is it just not being a Thatcherite? Is it being a slightly more centrist Conservative? Is it a distinctive philosophical stance?
I mean, obviously, it had a very long, complicated history going all the way back to the 19th century. But by the time I got to Parliament, it basically meant the One Nation dining club. So like all these things, it reduced really to a group of people. And it was a group of people sitting around a table, of whom the most eminent was Ken Clarke. And it stretched to, people you would have heard of, but, David Liddington was a really important part of it, and James Arbuthnot and Nick Bowles. And we had Richard Benyon, Nicholas Soames. I mean, we had dinner once every 2 weeks, and we talked, and we were almost without Amber Rudd eventually, Nicky Morgan. We were without exception pro-European, Alistair Burt. We were, generally speaking, people who, in Thatcherite terms, would have been called wets. We were tended to be much more comfortable with immigration, much more anxious about welfare policy. I mean, basically, we were more left-wing. I mean, it's not much more complicated than that. So what was, but it had odd elements. I mean, we came up eventually with sort of funny, when it came to leadership, we actually produced a little manifesto, which included things like spending 0.7% on international aid and not merging the departments and really focusing on Scotland and all this sort of stuff.
The centre ground you speak about a lot too. The radical centre is something I've heard you say. Centrism has become a bit of a dirty word, especially for young people who think that the problems we're facing today brook no compromise. What's your response to those to that?
Well, I think centre is probably a horrible word, but fundamentally politics has to be about pluralism. It has to be about compromise in the kind of biggest, most generous sense. It has to be about acknowledging that we are, tens of millions of individuals formed in a whole series of unstable and unwieldy coalitions with very, very different expertises and views of the world. And politics is a partnership. It's a partnership. It's an ethical partnership between the politician and citizen in which we try together to work out what the good life for our society is. So it has to be about listening. It has to be about humility. It has to be about acknowledging contrasting, conflicting values. And so for me, the centre is just a shortcut for talking really about that type of partnership.
I think that leads us very nicely into the last thing I want to talk to you about before I quickly, if you give us an extra 5 minutes, won't you, Rory? We'll do some audience questions. But I want to talk about seriousness, because I think of all the things you've been saying since you left for the States, seriousness seems to be the key thing, and probably before getting things done. I remember you appearing on an edition of Question Time when I was younger, and you had just been made the prisons minister, and you were talking about, asking people to judge you by what you get done and saying you'd resign if you didn't meet your targets. So can you tell us a little bit more about this, and briefly, why do you think seriousness is not popular at the moment? Is it simply those populist sort of movements that you spoke about earlier, or is it something else?
So we could talk forever about this, but let's just take one element of this, which is the getting things done. The reason I think why that's a bit tricky is that people are not quite sure how much power politicians really have or what to hold them responsible for. So I think it's very important that if you're the prisons minister and there's violence in prisons, you say, that's my problem, it's my fault, and I'm going to sort it out, and if I don't, I'll resign. But many people thinking about that, voters, other politicians, would think, really? I mean, there's the chief executive of the prison service, there are 125 prisons in England and Wales. I mean, what can you really do about it? Yes, you're theoretically accountable, but you're not really in charge, are you? Because there's a sense that that nobody can really find out where power is. But it's partly because people's expectations of politicians are very low. And it's very difficult for the public to judge when a politician is bullshitting. So you can't, it's very difficult to judge someone's record. I mean, I'm running to be mayor of London and I say, Sadiq Khan hasn't done a good job on the tubes. He should have sorted out the signalling on the Piccadilly line. What on earth is the voter meant to think? Well, Rory, you would say that, wouldn't you? Because you're trying to get elected. And how do I know whether Sadiq really can control the signalling on the Piccadilly line? Maybe he hasn't got a budget. So as a result, that's quite a fertile ground for somebody like Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson, by definition, doesn't campaign on getting things done. That's not really how his mind works. He doesn't do that kind of detail. He has a very sort of broad picture, sort of brusque, we're going to get Brexit done, we're going to make Britain great, or whatever it is. And he has sensed that the public, I mean, it's very struck by an interview he gave where he says that the secret of his success is that public think all politicians are schmucks, and his trick is to be open about it. Another way of framing it would be to say that the public think all politicians are kind of useless, impractical, and don't get anything done, and his secret is to be open about it. So yeah.
I was just going to say, well, Keir Starmer seems to me to be the exemplar of your serious politician. He was director of public institutions.
Right. So I'm really impressed by him, and he's very unusual because he's one of the only members of Parliament for a very long time to come into Parliament with a knighthood, right? An incredibly distinguished public servant. But he ain't doing so well, is he, in the polls? So there is a bit of a question there, which we keep coming back to. If you were looking for somebody to hire as your accountant, or you were trying to hire someone to run your pizza business, presumably you'd be more tempted to hire the kind of serious guy than the other one, right? But that isn't how voters think. And that's something to do with the fact that we're not really somehow in the business of choosing people on the basis of how smart and thoughtful they are in governing. Competence doesn't seem to matter that much. And it's, and you can sense it also even in Joe Biden's successful campaign. Very little about it was about track record or policy. It largely seemed to come down to, I'm not that other guy.
So, Max Weber says you've got to do both. You've got to do head and the heart. One of the criticisms of Starmer is that, unlike all the other successful Labour leaders of the past, Attlee, Blair, look on Where Power Stops, says Blair is obsessed with getting things done, but they had a coherent vision for a different Britain. Is that what's missing?
I think you can be a more boring, serious politician if people have a sense that you have a clear idea of where you're going and what you stand for. And I think that's probably right. I think what Keir Starmer has to get to is a sense that people can immediately identify what his values are, what kind of person he is, above and beyond the fact that he's obviously a clever person.
Rory, thank you. I've been far too indulgent. I'm going to quickly run through some questions from the audience because we've had loads, and I'll try and get through a few if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Before we wrap up. The first one is far cry from where we've been sort of having the conversation. Could you explain to us, this is from a Gabriel Barton Singer, could you explain to us why Tristram Shandy is your favourite book?
Yes, because I think it's firstly unbelievably funny. Secondly, I think it's incredibly sort of madly British. I think there's no sort of better evocation of the kind of centre of the English soul. I think it's got the wisest possible insight into the meaning of life. I think his attempts to break life down into almost its constituent seconds. And I think its hero, which for me is Uncle Toby. So, who represents such an extraordinary degree of kind of grace and nobility and charm. He's the kind of perfect sort of knight. And so anybody who is not obsessed with Tristram Shandy, I would recommend it. And if you can't bear to read it, there's an amazing Royal National Institute of the Blind recording of it, read beautifully, if you want something to send you to sleep at night or keep you awake at night.
Well, there you go. We'll do three more questions. One is anonymous, and I don't know if that's telling, and it just says, were you a spy?
No. Next question, James.
Brilliant. Flying through. As a member, this is another anonymous question. As a member of the Conservative Party...
I say no to all anonymous questions.
As a member of the Conservative Party, you often voted in accordance with the party line, for example, in favour of austerity measures. If you were to vote on the same issues now, would you have changed your position at all?
I think the answer is, as a party member, you vote with the party almost all the time. And what you have to do if you're uncomfortable with those things is not vote against the party on the individual vote, but leave the party. The Westminster system of government, and that's why these websites are like They Work For You, which try to evaluate MPs on individual votes, are kind of mad, because The truth of the matter is that Labour MPs, like Conservative MPs, vote 98% of the time in their party whip, and that's part of the tradition of British government, which is that you stand on a manifesto, you're elected as a Conservative, you vote basically as a Conservative. I rebelled occasionally when things were so extreme, so over Brexit, for example, where I thought it was tearing up 40 years of relationship with Europe. But broadly speaking, you vote with the government. And I think the other thing to understand, which I'm not sure is very clear to people, is that if you're a government minister, you're bound by this doctrine of collective responsibility, which means you're not actually even allowed to vote against the government on these issues. So if you don't like that, you should be standing for Parliament as an independent, or you should be standing for another party where you feel comfortable voting with that party's whip. But it isn't realistic to expect somebody to be a Labour Party MP or a Conservative Party MP consistently voting against their party. It's actually, in some sense, it wouldn't be democratic.
There's a question about the Sarah Everard case, which has come in, given the tragic events in the last week. That makes sense. It reads, you worked in the Ministry of Justice and stood for Mayor of London, so you'll be familiar with these questions about policing. The Met is coming in for strong criticism for its handling of the Virgils held at the weekend. Firstly, is the response to the vigil the manifestation of an institutional problem, or is this the product of the grey areas surrounding protest in the age of lockdown?
I think it is, yes, grey area, but it's also about leadership and consistency and values. I think, and this is where I would be a little bit critical of mayors of London, not just Sadiq Khan, but actually predecessors going back. It is clearly, I think, the role of the Mayor of London to define the culture of policing in London. And I would expect, if I were Mayor, that I would be speaking to the Commissioner of the Met almost daily. And I would try to make it clear in public statements what sort of policing you want. It seems to me absolutely clear that the type of policing we saw is not the kind of policing we want. But what doesn't make sense to me is Sadiq Khan coming out after the event saying, well, I'm very concerned by this, I'll give the Commissioner a call. Because ultimately, I feel he should have been on top of this from the beginning. I mean, this goes back to this question of seriousness and what the responsibility of a politician is. I think your responsibility is to run these things and define these things. And that was bad policing, but it reflects a political problem, not just a problem within the police.
We'll finish on this one because it probably makes sense. A question about your personal future. You've made it clear you are keen to be involved in politics again. COVID scuppered your plans for the London mayoral race. Would you like to stand again for Mayor of London, or has that moment passed? Do you wish to be returned to Parliament again?
So I'd love to be. I mean, being Mayor of London would be a great dream. I realised through the course of my campaign as an independent how brutal that is to go up against those big parties over months. When they're spending, as I say, £4 million and trying to build your own infrastructure. We did pretty well, but it was shattering. I mean, I left that campaign having, I suppose, raised £1.2 million, built up this volunteer network, set up all these borough things. But you are essentially kind of building your battleship while you're fighting it. It's as much a sort of management startup role as it is normal political campaigning, because you're having to recruit thousands of people and define every policy on every issue all the time. So I think it's very difficult for somebody like me who's not comfortable with parties. I mean, if we loop back to that person who asked about the whip, I gave quite a slick answer constitutionally to it. But the truth of the matter, of course, is that I'm embarrassed and I'm ashamed about a lot of the ways that I voted. And I found it very, very difficult having to vote with party whips rather than vote on each piece of legislation on the basis of what I thought of the legislation. And that's why I would like to see a very different British constitution. And in particular, I'd like to see a separation between members of parliament and ministers. I don't think they should come from the same place. I think it's taking all your ministers from your members of parliament. It's kind of incredibly restricted, narrow sort of pool of people you're drawing from, many of whom simply don't have the skills to do these very complicated jobs. So, yeah, I love to get involved in British public service again, but it's not likely, unfortunately. I mean, Boris Johnson is understandably very angry with me and isn't going to give me any kind of job. And ditto, nor are any of the other parties. So I have to find a way of trying to be helpful. And that may be getting involved in a charity or in a non-profit capacity or writing or thinking, or it might ultimately involve spending a few years living in the Middle East and doing something useful outside Britain before I return.
It might also involve you coming to the Cambridge Union and making your case in person at some point in the future. Rory Stewart, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time today. I'm really grateful, and I know our members are too. For those who watched, this will be available on YouTube straight after this. But thank you very much for watching, and thank you for your excellent questions. Good night.
Good night.